them. You can leave them with our staff at the end of the day. You can email them to us. The most important thing on all of this is to get your feedback. There's feedback online, like I said, hard copies, and then we'll have an open discussion. So, next slide. Okay, so the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, we actually skipped one, but it doesn't matter. The International Joint Commission was formed in 1909 under the Boundary Waters Treaty to resolve disputes between then Canada represented by Great Britain and the United States, generally on water quantity issues and water, not water quality issues. But in 1972, the governments of Canada and the United States asked the IJC to figure out what's going on with nutrient enrichment in Lake Erie. They gave them a reference that led to the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement of 1972. And this past year was the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. In the Water Quality Agreement, there's the creation of the Water Quality Board, principal policy advisor to the Commission, and the Science Advisory Board. And in the 2012 protocol, the Science Advisory Board has a Science Priority Committee, mostly academics, and a Research Coordination Committee with government scientists as well. I represent the Science Priority Committee. My co-chair here, Val, represents the RCC. And one of the things we did was say that, in our opinion, we've got great investment in restoration. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative in the United States has gone through the roof in terms of cleaning up the geographic areas concerned. We just had an announcement in the Canadian budget of a Canadian Great Lakes Protection Act, which will infuse a lot more money into the Great Lakes. This is fixing past mistakes. What we know as scientists at IAGLR is that we do not have the science to track today's problems. The lakes are changing dramatically. We just heard Linda talking about climate change. We've heard about plastic pollution, invasive species, all manners of things. If we can't predict the future of the Great Lakes, we're not going to be able to protect the socioeconomic vitality of the region. That depends on the quality of the Great Lakes region. So we believe, as the Science Advisory Board and the Commission agrees with us, the International Joint Commission, that we need a Great Lakes strategy for the next decade. And I'm going to turn it over to Val to talk about what that looks like, and then we'll take your questions.
Thanks, Gail. The overarching objectives of the Great Lakes Science Strategy are really to usher in a new era of Great Lakes research and develop the knowledge base we need to do in order to manage the system effectively. So the question is, why now? I mean, honestly, I think the question is, why haven't we done this sooner? But in any case, I mean, the Great Lakes look nothing like they did, say, 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, and 20 or 30 years into the future, they are going to be vastly different. We don't know what that's going to be. And of course, one of the principal questions we're always asked is, what will the future bring? And for managers and people understanding and managing the ecosystem, they want to know, what will we do and how can we anticipate the changes we will see? Ultimately, you want to predict the future. The only way you can do that is if you have a model of the system which incorporates all of the relevant dynamics within the system and the interactions between them. And that's the basic science, and you need the data at a high enough resolution in time and space to actually verify and calibrate those models so we have some comfort with respect to the predictions, the forecasts, the projections that those models make that were reasonably reliable and that managers can rely on, because management decisions, policy, and those are decadal strategies or decadal decisions ultimately go to how we restore the system, how we protect the system, and how we make it sustainable. Now, this is not about restoration. I mean, eventually, I hope that we get out of the restoration business. We will deal with all the ills of the past, and the responsibility we have with the future is to protect ourselves against ills of the future. It has a great economic benefit. I mean, for example, I know one cleanup, a PCB cleanup in Green Bay was $1.3 billion. to avoid a cost like that would easily pay for the Great Lakes Science Strategy with quite a bit of a significant amount of change left over. Decadal science strategies are not new, except in the Great Lakes. I mean, the oceanographic community has been doing this for decades. Back to when I was a graduate student, the International Decade of Oceanographic Exploration, the AIDWE program. But in the Great Lakes, we have never really done a comprehensive decadal science strategy. And it's about time. The objectives of this strategy and the planning exercise were taken largely from the Decadal Ocean Survey, understanding what we currently invest, but also understanding what are the gaps in our science, understanding what's it going to take in terms of the infrastructure, the human resources, the workforce to fill those gaps, and what's it going to take in terms of the investment, in terms of funding, and how would we administer it. And some of these are the questions we are asking you to help us decide today. We first started this back in 2018. We held a town hall meeting at the Agler meeting that year. In 2019, the IJC Commission approved the moving forward with this initiative. And then in 2020-21, we held a series of workshops and surveys, which hopefully some of you participated in some or all of those. And the result, we had a draft of the final report authored largely by John Bratton and Limnotech, and did an excellent job. And that report was transmitted to the governments last fall. The priorities in terms of what the collective wisdom was is what you might expect: climate change, nutrient overload, watershed impacts, invasive species, etc. But also the group identified the fact that we are at a point now with respect to the tools we have for science in which we can enter in a new era, or I would say a renaissance in Great Lakes research. We now have remote sensing, autonomous systems, AUVs, gliders. We have genomics, so the whole omics technology now can actually determine what the biological response is to a particular stress. And of course, then there's the big data and artificial intelligence, and there are even papers here at this meeting about those sorts of things. The needs of underserved communities was highlighted as a major priority, and ecosystem services. The environment subsidizes every human activity, and we rarely, if ever, pay for that subsidy. We don't even know what that subsidy is, and that's part of the issue behind understanding what ecosystem services and the value. We may not know what they are, but I guarantee you they are on an order of billions of dollars in the Great Lakes system per year. Our current investment, this is 2019 data, but I suspect it hasn't changed very much, was around $250 million. About half of that is in US dollars, about half of that was in the US federal bucket. And USGS and EPA are the two largest players with respect to that. The science strategy identified 6 priorities. Basic process research, basically understanding how this system functions. You can't manage it unless you know that. Monitoring and long time series measurements that was brought up in the earlier talk on climate change. We do not have in this system a Hawaii Ocean Time Series like HOTS-like observation system or an LTR system in the Great Lakes. It is way overdue. It's high time we did. Enhanced models and forecasting systems. The Great Lakes is actually a leader in this area, I think, in terms of coastal science in general. Workforce development. Are we training the next generation of scientists? Now, I mean, this is totally anecdotal, and my observation. I have no data for this, but I've been attending our Agler meetings for a long time, and it's my observation that I see fewer and fewer students actually conducting research, what I would call oceanographic in scale, out on the lakes, using a vessel, doing that kinds of research. And it's not because they aren't interested or their advisors are not interested. It's because they simply do not have the wherewithal in terms of the support or the facilities to get them out there. In addition, science infrastructure. The fleet in the Great Lakes needs refurbishing. We need new analytical capabilities to take advantage of the new technologies. And centers of excellence were identified by the group as a key element. Many issues are interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary in nature. and have a need to extend beyond the length of the average, 2, 3, 4 year grant. And so centers of expertise we created in the Great Lakes. And finally, inclusion of broad socioeconomic and cultural perspectives, which has been highlighted here, when including obviously traditional ecological knowledge. The price tag for this is roughly estimated on the order of $100 million per year. We don't know what that number is, and that is in place with the next the next piece of this process goes forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Gail.
Thank you. So where we're going from here is to take this strategy that you heard, high-level strategy, 6 priority areas, rough estimate of investment, and turn it into an actual plan that could be implemented. And so we'll be having another one of these at IAGLR in a year's time, because by that point, we need to figure out exactly how much money for which attributes that Val just described to you. And also, really importantly, the governance framework. Is this a new entity? Is this money to the IJC? We don't think so. Is it money to another commission? How do we govern this thing? It's binational in nature or transnational in nature. Where does the money go, or the competitive grants? So all of that needs to be still worked out. What we wanted to today is talk with you about the strategy as it now stands, inform you that we're moving forward to the decadal science plan, and ask that you get involved and participate. So when you came in, you were probably given a handout, or maybe you can share one with a friend, that says in what ways, and this is a question for you to think about, in what ways do you believe the science plan can help advance the purpose of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement? If you're not familiar with the purpose of the agreement, it's to restore and protect the waters of the Great Lakes Basin ecosystem and its watersheds and so on. But in what ways do you believe the science plan can help advance the purpose of the agreement? If you want to answer that to us, there's a microphone right over here. We've got staff who can take a microphone over to you if you want. If you want to fill that out as you think about it, you can do it on paper. You can do it by scanning the QR code. Does anybody want to offer an answer to this question? Okay, we ask you to think about it. If you can enter some ideas right now, great. If you want to think about it and get back to us using the online form, excellent. It's the best that we can ask. Now, this one's a little bit more complicated. So in terms of percent effort, there's 6 basic things that Val just told you that we're talking about. Basic research process, monitoring long-term series data collection, forecasting systems, workforce development, science, centers of excellence, inclusion of broad socioeconomic perspectives. Do any of those seem to you to be of more importance than others? Or should they be equally weighted? Would you organize them in terms of percent effort? Basic process research, 10%, 20%, 30%. Centers of excellence, I vote 50% because I really like that idea. It's true. You have a question? Yes.
Thanks. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Laura Campbell with Michigan Farm Bureau. We've been sending Farm Bureau folks to the IAGLR meeting for a long time, especially working on making sure that we understand the science going on in the Great Lakes so that we can take that back to the farmers we work with on conservation programs and practices on the landscape to try to help address particularly the nutrient issues that the lakes are dealing with. And so in terms of this question, I want to really emphasize that I think a lot of effort and a lot of percentage of this investment needs to go to kind of that second half of the list of questions, right? So workforce development, we are desperately short of trusted advisors, experts with boots on the ground who can really help folks who are trying to implement things out in the countryside that are going to affect those in-stream and downstream and Great Lake impacts, the science infrastructure centers for excellence, demonstration projects, all of those projects that help for the communities as well as the farming community to see what's going on, to be able to ask questions, to be able to look at how things look on their landscape. And in particular, because we see this a lot, setting up those centers for excellence and those demonstration projects in the local area where people are, and regardless of what their aim is, making that so that someone can see themselves in it, can see their local community in it, can see their local, interests and practices in it are really important. And then including those broad socioeconomical and cultural perspectives, having those stakeholders at the table, having the folks who are in the Great Lakes Basin, and in particular, folks who depend on the landscape and the water for their livelihoods, is going to be crucial, I think, as well as really helping us to understand what are those things that we can do within the context of our current economic structure, and what are the kinds of things that are never going to pencil out with an ROI to say, okay, if I invest in this now, I'm going to make my money back. If that's not the case, how do we then supplement that to make that happen, knowing that it's something that needs to happen for the Great Lakes? So I really appreciate this question.
Thank you so much for that, addition. One of the things that we are going to be doing in the next year is a series of workshops looking at each one of these elements, and stakeholder inclusion is central to this. The science needs to help those on the ground do what they can do to contribute to Great Lakes excellence. So fantastic input. Thank you very much for that. Mike.
Hello, I'm Michael Twiss from Algoma University. And I think that the most important factor here is number 4, which is workforce development. Without that properly done, none of that will work.
It's true.
And the people that are going to support this are the people in the region. They're the ones who are going to be paying for this through their taxes. They need to know that there's some reciprocity there. So they're working for their own environment, and what they're doing is going to be reflected in jobs and for their futures. And I think the people in the Great Lakes region will definitely support something like that. And I fully believe that politicians will as well.
Thank you. That's a very astute observation, because without the workforce, as you said, Michael, how are you going to get the work done?
I can make a comment, Michael, that we have a graduate program in freshwater science, and we have a professional science master's degree program, which is a non-thesis degree program. 97% of those students are getting jobs in the field. There's a huge demand for our graduates, and we are not fulfilling that demand, I think. And we look at who are going to be the workforce of the future. We're not doing a good enough job. We need it, and I totally agree. We need a big investment in graduate student fellowships, postdocs, et cetera.
Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Mark Epp from the Great Lakes Data Watershed, and we're a repository for Great Lakes Data, another hub. One thing I wanted to, I'm not sure where this item fits, but I wanted to point out monitoring is not much good by itself unless the data is available. And I'm sure everybody knows that. So I think it's real critical, and I don't know what the percentage is, but maybe it's not a large percentage of funding, but it's really a critical first step is to have a data infrastructure where we can all share data. And I like to call what I think it should be the open smart lake. Okay. So not open source, open standard smart lake. So I think the one question I have is which of those would cover that? Would that be infrastructure, the data systems?
Probably an integration of the two of them, or the three: workforce, infrastructure, and the long-term data sets. And I do know that the Great Lakes Observing System had a session here yesterday, and they are engaged. Matthew Child, who just handed you the microphone, talked with them about this. They're engaged there.
Well, I am talking to them.
So absolutely. This is why the process for coming up with a plan needs to be coordinated across a lot of different entities, because each one has a different kind of role to play. I'll listen to your question. I'm not exactly sure which one it goes into, but when we go into detail in the workshops that will look at each one of these in detail, that's when we would put in the structure about where would that repository, where could it sit? So it's a very informative question that you're asking, and that will also inform our debates and our discussions
Yeah,
over the course of the year.
I'm saying the monitoring is not worth anything without that piece.
Absolutely.
So, thank you.
Thank you. No, there isn't. While we're waiting for the microphone to go elsewhere, Mark, is there anybody online that has a question that you'd like to share with us?
There's no questions online right now.
If you could read one for us.
I'm sorry, there are no questions.
There are no
online.
questions. Okay, go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Lisa Sonnenberg from the Lake Superior National Marine Conservation Area. And one thing, sort of two parts. One, I am really, really happy that basic research is on there because I love calling my area of the North Shore of Lake Superior as the black hole of data. I do not have decent bathymetry data. I do cultural resource management. It's very hard to do my job without this like basic level mapping data. So awesome. I also would like to mention, we're talking about workforce development and the inclusion of socioeconomic and cultural perspectives. I think part of that workforce development, it's not just students and postdocs, it also should be targeted like communities and Indigenous communities. I have our site, we have numerous Indigenous communities. They lack capacity, but they want to do this stuff, but they don't have the people to do it. So that as part of that workforce development, I think there also needs to be a focus on bringing in, you can say diversity, inclusion, whatever you want, not just the regular people who normally go into that, but, focusing on people who are underrepresented populations, Indigenous people, people of color, the whole 9 yards. That should also be, I guess, part of that workforce development
Thank you.
as well.
Thank you. We've got one more at the back, and then we're going to go to another. Oops, we've got another one this way.
Yeah, thanks. Andrew Muir, Great Lakes Fishery Commission. Gail, you mentioned governance structure for this initiative, maybe on the last slide or one of the slides. And I almost view these 6 things sort of flowing in reverse order from the governance structure, because one of the things we're fortunate in the Great Lakes, we have tons of great scientists doing tons of great science. We have great training programs. How that all becomes coordinated to me sort of relates to the governance structure, and the IJC has shown great leadership in bringing this plan together, but how it's sort of implemented and funded through setting up the right governance structure to me involves including broad socioeconomic, cultural perspectives. That then leads to the development of infrastructure and centers of excellence, which will train a workforce to do numbers 1, 2, and 3. So I kind of see it that way in terms of how this works, kind of a top-down structure. But I think they're all equally important, but how we kind of pull those together, to me, seems really critical.
I hope you hold on to that thought, because one of the closing questions here revolves around how to get to that place. So we'll come back to that and have that conversation. Take one more question on this side, and then we'll move to the next one. Matthew's getting his footsteps in. Are you at 5,000 yet? On your way to 10,000?
Soon.
Thanks. My name's Olivia Johnson. I work for the H2 Ohio Wetland Monitoring Program out of Kent State and Lake Erie and Aquatic Research Network. I want a second and third and fourth workforce development priority. And I also want to, again, push back against it's not just graduate students and involving students in research. People interact and connect to the environment in a lot of different ways, not always through science research. And we train people to be radiology technicians in hospitals. We can train people to be sensor technicians in the Great Lakes. And I think we have to think deeply about how much of that theoretical background someone needs to do a skill-based job. So what sort of skill-based workforce development programs can the IGC sort of support. And I also want to second that, you know, I work for a monitoring program. We think all the time and get data requests and they want our data available. And as researchers, university researchers, we're sometimes hesitant to share data without context. So how are we supporting information products and kind of rapid, nimble production of those products as that real-time monitoring data occurs? Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for that input. You have this thing working? Mine's not working. Pushing the wrong button. Yeah. Can we get slide to advance? There we go. Whoops. Uh-oh. Now I'm going right to the end. All right. This is kind of similar, but in terms of extent of effort, there's some one-time capital investments that are here. Remember, when we're talking about $100 million a year for 10 years, on top of remediation work. And that's just roughly, because we'll be finalizing that. But some of the bigger dollar items are enhancing the fleet, the monitoring infrastructure, data architecture, for example, analytical capacity, laboratories, for example, centers of excellence, if they are physical centers. If you have a sense where you believe that investment should be prioritized, we look forward to you giving that to us. If you want to speak now to it, if something stands out at you that you know really needs significant investments, please share that with us. Otherwise, do propose it in the survey forms that we put out for you to look at. Yes, ma'am.
I'm jumping the gun here, Gail. But yeah, one thing that I really think is missing from this, and maybe it could be fit within monitoring, maybe it could be managed by a Center for Excellence, but the data management aspect. And so how are we making, like I think an earlier speaker referred to these nimble data products, but how are we going to ensure that this data is, you know, QA/QC'd and openly available to people in a, you know, updated frequently? I think that that's going to need to be resourced, because that can't be done on the backs of, you know, technology transfer activities by graduate students. That really has to be something, I think, that's systematic and that's funded adequately.
That's very good. Thank you. Thank you so much. We're making notes. Matthew can't make notes right now, but we're making notes because that's an important point. That's come up a couple times here. So that's really insightful. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Shelby Brenner with the Great Lakes Observing System. Another thing for all of these to think about is not just the one-time capital investment, but the maintenance and support that goes on. And I know that's probably in the works, but thinking about what groups or organizations can handle the long-term maintenance, because anything that gets built still needs that maintenance funds, and those aren't insignificant, even though the hard part is really the one-time capital, but just thinking about that too, something that I want to make sure it's not forgotten.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
If I may, I'm Bopi Bidanda from Grand Valley State. As a former oceanographer, I fully applaud this vision, especially like in the scale of the ocean decadal scale thinking. One thing I find missing though, that we might want to consider, is oceans have marine protected areas, though, you know, arguably very, very minimal. We should think of something like that for the Great Lakes. Yes, we do have 2 marine sanctuaries, but, you know, one in Lake Michigan and one for since at least 3 decades in Lake Huron. But they are exclusively for the protection of shipwrecks, not natural resources. And in a world, you know, just focusing on GDP and not paying as we go for our natural resources, I think, you know, if we don't save, we will, despite all our other efforts, we will lose the Great Lakes.
Yeah, thank you.
Should be part of our thinking.
We will have to think carefully about how the science, for example, fresh science can help inform the location of those places. And then it's a policy decision about what to call them. Yeah.
Hi, Robert Stewart from Lakehead University. I guess what I'm having a struggle with is thinking about how do we upscale the science before we re-envision the role of science in these new issues that we've avoided, the emerging issues. So when you go from cause and effect, point source science, expert driven, to cumulative, uncertain effects from the landscape, you're into risk management. And the role of science is very different when you're managing risk. And it means the people who bear the risk are in the best place to decide what to do. So I'm wondering why we're not asking these different value systems, non-science people around the lake, what questions they need answered, what science they need. And I know we've done a bit of that, but you know, just that one comment on there about value systems and socioeconomics. It's not about us as academics studying that and imposing, you know, a range of issues to people. It's about getting people on the ground with scientists so that we bridge the values gap. And when we start dealing with problems that are philosophical or modeled future scenarios, you deal with what we dealt with in the pandemic, very different views on science, the role of science, what the future is going to be like. And that's just a very different world that science serves in a different way than, you know, studying phosphorus so that we can convince industry why we're regulating them. So just going back to that idea that, you know, we're moving into a different risk management process, and the impacts are coming from the watershed and cultures and cultural behavior. So those types of questions before we figure out the tools to go out and study those dynamics, in addition to the great science we have, of course. Yeah.
And I would say that one of the intention, not one of that, there is every intention that when we do the workshops to pull this together, that it's a diverse group of people who we invite to come, because you need to know what different sectors see as the science need. We try to do that as we develop the broad scale strategy, but as we go down to the plan, we need that kind of consultation, and you just emphasize that for us to pay attention to. Yes.
Hi, Katie Williams. I'm with the EPA in Duluth. And one thing that strikes me, and actually your question just made me think about this, the role of science is changing. And at the same time, I think some of those emerging, some of those centers of excellence are already emerging. So I wonder if some of the things we need to think about is, what do we want these centers of excellence to do? And how can we build up the capacity in those places so they can mentor other places and build up more?
Thank you. Yeah, we've envisioned centers of excellence around domains. For example, we have a day and a half, I don't know how long, Karen, but day, Rebecca, like an entire day on what are we doing about plastics? Well, maybe there's a center of excellence that consolidates all these different people from all over the place, including industry and governments, and figuring that out. We've talked about it with our First Nations as well, that a center of excellence that helps understand the integration of TEK with Western science might be an example. We haven't defined in detail what each one of those centers would do. I've actually envisioned a center where you model education entirely after K-12 around the Great Lakes, where you talk about geography, you talk about culture, you talk about music, you talk about arts, you talk about science, geography, engineering, anything. And you open it up to the point earlier for a community to get into and learn about. So we haven't yet defined specifically what each center would do. That's coming up in the next phase. But certainly your point, I think, is if, you know, once we start developing that, where are other ones developing, and how do we have that communication with them so that we help each other develop those centers? There's no duplication, but there's a learning experience together.
Just to clarify, that sounds like you're considering these centers of excellence as topical instead of geographic? Or?
Not necessarily. They could be, that's an example. It could be because we have the lake-wide management plans. So do we have a center of excellence for Superior? Anybody doing anything? But we don't know yet. That's why we need to consult. We had these high-scale ideas. There was consensus that they could fulfill a number of different roles. And we have those conversations. We would like to see them geographically diverse, but what topics they cover or what part of the Great Lakes they cover has yet to be defined. So we'll be thinking and defining those. Robert, Mark.
We have an, can you hear? We have an online question from Rupert Kindersley. What is the plan to ensure full coordination on all science projects within this initiative with all government agencies, academia, and private organizations to ensure no duplication of effort? How are the results of this initiative and progress going to be communicated?
Thank you for the question. Right now, through the leadership of the International Joint Commission's Great Lakes Regional Office, they've been having conversations with the Great Lakes Commission, with the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, with the Alliance for the Great Lakes, with GLOS, with others, to say, how do we co-create this? The idea is we've been sharing this, the first report that Val just summarized. We shared it with the governments of Canada and the United States. We anticipate that this is going to be a collaborative effort. This is not an IJC only led thing. We don't have that kind of responsibility nor that kind of ego to think that we could pull that off, because to the question that we just got asked, it's really about a collaborative co-development of the strategy so that everybody understands what role they could have in it and how they could influence it. So I hope that answers the question.
Gail, we have one question over here. Just a quick time check. We have about 10 minutes remaining.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Cynthia Collier. I work for GGIT, a contractor that supports the US EPA Glenpo. Just want to point out that one of the difficulties with the Great Lakes, especially the transnational nature, is that it's hard to know where to go to start looking for data or to start looking for information. So as you consider whether to create a new standalone authority or new things, that the more new things you create, the harder it is to find. So if the more centralized or building off something that has a reputation as the place to go to find information might be a better starting point.
Thank you. Thank you for answering the question on the screen. Really appreciate that. I'm curious if there are other, so an existing, so you're leaning towards, for example, either an existing institution or several existing transnational Great Lakes agencies working together rather than a de novo new one. So we're curious about your opinions on that. There's a hand back here. Yeah.
Hi, this is Dick Norton. I'm a planner and a lawyer from the University of Michigan, and I'm going to pull you off topic again a little bit. Sorry about that, but I wanted to riff on a question that was just brought up, or comment about the focus of the scientific research going on, particularly from a natural science ecosystem perspective. The primary way I think that we've been approaching it is through the ecosystem services perspective, which is a helpful way to think about it from an economics perspective. But I always think about where local officials are coming from when they're presented with a project that they have to approve or not. And what they really want to know is, do I need to protect this resource, or can it be manipulated? Or, you know, where's the threshold? Where's the limit? What can I allow to happen? So maybe another way to be thinking about it from that perspective is more from the perspective of where humans always want to manipulate the environment to make it habitable. Where do we really need to keep things natural and functioning for their life support purposes? And where can we manipulate them? And that maybe that's okay. And I don't see that kind of work. I think I come at it from coastal shoreline management. Where do we need to let the shoreline be natural? And where can we maybe manipulate it? And what are the limits of that? So just another, maybe this is part of your workshops to get stakeholder perspectives, but there's a missing piece of this that I think is really vital for local officials that I don't see getting discussed much.
Right.
So I wanted to put that on the table. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're talking about science to better understand and forecast and protect the future of the Great Lakes, so we don't spend billions of dollars cleaning up contaminated sediment. But to an earlier question, also the gentleman in front here, you know, marine protected areas, where do we put them? Well, I think we need some more science to tell us where are the systems resilient, where are the systems that need to be protected. So, but it's an important point for us to think about. I know we're going to be short on time, so if I can get this, where am I supposed to point this anyway? There we go. So, this is more about the process question. This is going to be a big financial ask. We already talked about the governance structure. I'm hearing just a little bit from you so far about, don't create something brand new. It's too confusing. And I agree, the alphabet soup of Great Lakes institutions is very confusing. But is this something like, we're looking for your advice on the process by which we form the entity. So is this something like National Academy of Science and Canadian Centers of CCA, Canadian Society of Royal Society of Canada? Do they do a study that looks at there are binational, transnational institutes for science all over the world on shared waters. Should they be doing a study to look at the models around the world and say what works in the Great Lakes? Or is this a consulting firm type of piece of information? And this is a very practical type of question. Are there, do you think the IJC should have the responsibility to do all the convening, formulate an administrative structure, formulate where the home would be? Is this looking at a scholarly piece of analysis? Is this simply a consulting firm who's good at this kind of stuff? Any of you have any ideas just on the process? Very practical type of question that we're looking for your feedback on. If you don't really care, that's fine too. But if you do care and you want to send your ideas, you want to contemplate it a little bit, we welcome that. Mark, there's another comment at the chat. Is that the last question?
There's a comment and a question, I think here. It says seeking an authorization appropriation is going to be the highest profile, most likely to be a long-term approach. Maybe add it to the proposed Great Lakes Authority.
We just learned that the Great Lakes Authority, that must have been a question from an American colleague. Great Lakes Authority is really aiming at the economy of the region. Clearly, the economy of the region is reliant on the science protecting the socioeconomic and environmental quality of the Great Lakes region. Not sure the Great Lakes Authority is the right one, but it's an interesting point that an authorization or appropriation, if it's very high profile, could be a lever for getting political support for this as well. So it's an interesting contribution to the conversation. Are there any other comments? We have probably about 2-3 minutes left before we've got about 5 minutes. We're open to any other comment or feedback that you have to offer. Please go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Again, Laura Campbell with Michigan Farm Bureau. I think I would put in a plug for trying to get somebody to kind of design this process and form the entity as ideally somebody who doesn't have a dog in the fight, right? I would put a consulting firm in charge of it because that way you've got assurance for all of the stakeholders at the table that the process is going to be fair and that there's not going to be the perception of somebody kind of, putting their thumb on the scale toward, oh, well, we know our agency would like to do a lot of this work. And so we're going to, obviously design it to be housed by us and we're going to run it. And we're going to decide who gets the money. If that process is removed from anybody who might then be a part of that process moving forward, I think probably that's going to be the one that is going to satisfy all parties the most.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you for chiming in on that. Yes, please.
Hi there. My name is Scott Parker with Parks Canada. And to the point of protection versus restoration and the economics of it all, I work in protected area authorities. And to be frank, we don't have a large body of evidence that protection works. It's hard to sell new parks and protected areas and demonstrate that because we had a fish sanctuary that made a difference to not only the fishes, but to community well-being and those sorts of things. So I would strive to find more of a body of evidence of why these protection works in the first place, using our existing protected areas. And maybe to the point earlier about some of them, these sites that have a cultural heritage focus, they also can advance sort of a natural heritage ethos and value as well. So using the spectrum of protected areas to show the value that they can contribute would help generate more protected areas, I think.
It's interesting. Thank you. That's very interesting. Everybody wants more protected areas, but that's an interesting perspective on protected areas. And I can't get this to advance any further. So I don't know if that was our last slide. Oops. Right, that was our last slide. Do you have any advice? So that was, I guess, my last slide. Yes, we have some more advice. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Erin Redding. I'm with the New York Department of Environmental Conservation and New York Natural Heritage Trust. I like that this is a 10-year plan that feels long compared to a lot of plans that we implement in our region, but it also feels short. And I'd like to know, or like to encourage, going back to a comment from over here and to that one-time investment, how can there be an endowment for stewardship? Because we really need that. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm all for endowments. Yeah, that's an excellent idea. And we started the project off talking about decadal science modeled after oceanic issues. But if you heard it when Val was talking about it, it's a new era of science, really. And we don't think it stagnates after 10 years. But I do like the concept of an endowment. And it speaks to protected areas as well. So thank you for that input. Our time is very short. We do know that you have to go to other sessions. So if you have to leave, we understand. If you want to stay and ask a few more or give us some more feedback, please go ahead.
Rochelle Sturdivant with Michigan Sea Grant. I just want to kind of as a crosscut to all of this, to not forget the social sciences, the communication science, the education science, and understanding how better to communicate our work to inspire the next generations. As a key component of research, it's not just the research on the environment itself, but the research about the people of the basin.
Thank you so much. And I do want to assure you that we started off as natural science, and then we had people from our water quality board, for example, said exactly what you said. Social science research is essential in here too, and it is in here. We just didn't highlight it today, but thank you. And we are considering that. It's just social scientists need a lot of brain power. They don't need as many vessels.
This is Dick Nording. I'm just tackling it up. Please think about legal issues as well. So it's not just social science, but how we view science or how we use it is very much shaped by the legal mandates that we're working within, and the way those mandates structure our expectations about what nature is doing and how we ought to manipulate it. And my sense in working with science-oriented entities is that scares them because they want, and I totally get it. They don't want to be involved, perceived to be lobbying or any of that, but you can't really understand how science can be useful to people unless you really understand all of the systems that people are working within and the legal aspects that is really important. So as you set up structures to do this, I would urge you to figure out some way to open the space to allow that legal piece of it to become part of the discussion as well, not just the natural science or even just the social science too often gets broken down into economics, and social science is way more than that, and people behave for way more reasons. And the legal mandates they're working under is a huge effect, and yet we can't seem to talk about that much. So I want to just urge that to be part of the conversation as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And one of the things that personally I'm very motivated for is that the science inform policy. You know, that if you're investing in science, you want to affect change in society, you need to influence policy, and policy leads to legal legislation, enablers, and so on. So thank you for the emphasis on that. I do want to be polite to the sessions that are going on right now. So I'm going to thank you all for spending your time over lunch with us. If you bought a sandwich, I hope it was good. Your input is being recorded. If you want to send us further input, think about it a bit more, please use the form, use the 2-pager, use whatever means you want. And thanks for joining us this afternoon.